a few months ago, friends from the English department came over to me and had this idea. And my dear friend Lisa Schwab, who went on to another job, is no longer part of YU. This was her idea, and I really thank her so much. I know she's on Zoom, and I really want to thank Lisa. I want to thank my partners at the English department who've been real partners on this, not only thinking about how this novel can inform their own classes and create really a dialogue, a conversation among students in different classes and different settings, which is a really special thing, right? Where you can have kind of echoes of each other. There's some echoes going on right now. So I really want to thank Rachel Nash and David Forrest and the other members of the English department. I'm going to miss people, so I'm sorry. I want to thank my dear friend and colleague Jess Olson, who has invited this whole thing started as possibly a Zoom session as part of his graduate course at the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies and the Fish Center for Genocide and Holocaust Studies, which I believe all your students are online. And it bloomed into this wonderful live event with people with delicious food. I want to give a shout out to the CAF staff, Sam Chazen and his maiden cooks who created this beautiful kosher dairy Indian food right here in the heart of Washington Heights. Who would have thought? So I hope you enjoy and you're nourished from that. And I just want to say, universities are places for the universe to come together. For different parts of the world, different languages, different cultures, different ways of looking at the world can come together, can challenge each other, can learn from each other. And that's what it's all about. And so to have an author and a book that does that in itself, if you've read the book, I know many of you have read parts of the book, I encourage you to read the entire novel. You will travel. We'll travel in time, we'll travel in place, we'll travel in souls. And it's really a wonderful, wonderful opportunity to do this all together with you guys here in the room. Those of you on Zoom, sorry for the delay. People have to get their plates filled. And we are going to start. Those of you on Zoom, please send in questions. To the best of our ability, we'll send those questions onwards. And a recording of this event will be made available in a few days, so watch out for that. And without any further ado, I want to introduce my friend and colleague, David Forrest, from the English department. So thank you, David.
Thank you. Thanks, Ronnie. I may have to quickly run over to the laptop to admit people into the Zoom meeting. So if I have to run over, I'm going to do that quickly. Oh, okay. All right, great. All right, we're on it. So we're thrilled to have you here, Jai. And pretty much the evening we'll keep it pretty loose, but first we'll have Jess come up and give an introduction for Jai, and then Jai will hopefully read a bit from the book, and we'll talk a bit about his process, his research, and his journey. And again, those on Zoom, feel free to type in your questions. I'll be monitoring. And for those here in person, thank you for being here in person. And think of any questions you may have and save them. We'll have a discussion toward the end. Jess, say something.
Evening. It's such a pleasure to be here and such a pleasure to welcome Jai Chakrabarti to our campus here in Washington Heights. I should say, on a personal note, reading this novel I found to be just an extraordinary experience. It is really an exceptional piece of work. For those of you, I'm assuming everybody who's here has obviously read and studied the book very carefully. But in case you need to go over it again, I would highly recommend it afterwards because it is just that good. Jai is a writer of fiction originally born in Calcutta, India. He did his training at Brooklyn College. His short fiction has been featured in the O. Henry Prize stories, in the Best American Stories, and he's the winner of a Pushcart Prize. This novel, A Play for the End of the World, is his first novel. And I hope it will be the first of many. It is just that good. And without further ado, I welcome to the podium Mr. Jai Chakrabarti.
Hi, everybody. It's so great to be here with you. I want to start off first by thanking Ronnie and Jess and Dave for having me here tonight, and also for Liesel, who perhaps is on Zoom in the metaverse. Thank you, Liesel, for making this wonderful connection. And, also what a gift to be with folks in person in a real life space with food. So thank you to the folks who are providing sustenance tonight. Just a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to read a little bit from my book, but I'm going to talk a bit about the impetus for it. Actually, you know what? I'm going to start with some of the historical context, which might be helpful for those of you who are not so familiar with the book. So this is the author's note. On July 18, 1942, weeks before the deportations to Treblinka, the Polish Jewish educator, medical doctor, and author Janusz Korczak staged a play at his orphanage in the Warsaw Ghetto. The performance was an adaptation of a novel, Dakar, by Tagore. Dakar literally means the calling house. Nowadays, it's translated as the post office. Rabindranath Tagore wrote Dakar in a village in India in 1911. A couple of years later, W.B. Yeats produced an English version. The play was then translated into many languages, and eventually a Polish copy ended up in the hands of Janusz Korczak, known to his children as Pan. The play is about a dying child living through his imagination, while Pan Doctor chose to stage the play to help his orphans reimagine ghetto life and to prepare them for what was to come. So that's the historical backdrop of this play that was written in India, that gets translated and performed in Poland decades later. And I want to tell you how I came across this story, because once I came across it, it became so important to me that it changed my entire interest in what I wanted to write about. And previous to this, I hadn't written any historical fiction. I was writing quite a lot of fiction, but it was of a very different kind. So I want to kind of take you into that story of how I came to learn about Janusz Korczak and how it changed my life. So before I can do that, I have to tell you that I was born in Kolkata, India. And I went to a school that's in the Guinness Book of World Records. So I don't know how many students are at Yeshiva University, but in this particular school, there were 15,500 students. So it's the most populous school. And despite the number of students that we had, which, by the way, you can imagine what recess was like. Despite the number of students we had, there was a real strong focus on the arts, on literature, and also on the performing arts. And when I was about the age that my son is now, so I have a 7-year-old, I was involved in some of the first lessons that I would get a chance to engage in. And in Bengal, Tagore is how we would think about Shakespeare. So Rabindranath Tagore was the first non-European to win a Nobel Prize in literature. He wrote plays, poems, novels, short stories. And if you went to the school that I did, you would certainly have a poem of Tagore's memorized, if not a few poems of Tagore's memorized. But I also got a chance to perform in some of these typical plays as a very, very minor part, because I assure you that I do not have any theater chops. But regardless, it was exciting as a child to be able to go up on stage in front of adults and get to perform without really understanding what it is that I was performing, because some of these plays had rather. Now, I'm going to fast forward from Kolkata, India, to many years later, and I'm now living in Jerusalem. So I'm now an adult living in Jerusalem, and I'm living there with my now wife, the poet Alana Bell, and the two of us have been there for quite a while. We arrived on a travel grant. She's writing poems, I'm writing fiction. And in our last day in the city, we go to Yad Vashem. And this is particularly meaningful for Alana because she's the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. And it's there at Yad Vashem that I first encountered the story of Janusz Korczak. And I learned that there was, in fact, a play that was performed in the Warsaw Ghetto at an exhibit about art in ghettos. And I am, of course, blown away that art would be evoked in such a place and time, but moreover, that it would be a piece of art that I am familiar with. Because if I take you back now again to that populous school in India, one of the plays that I was performing, where I had a very small part, was in fact the post office. And it was the post office that Janusz Korczak chose to stage in July of 1942, weeks before he and all of his children were rounded up to Treblinka. And learning that, I was absolutely transfixed. I wanted to understand that history more. I wanted to understand who Janusz Korczak was, why art would be invoked in such a place and time. And so that started off for me a long process of research, which would take me to Poland. It would take me to remote parts of India, and ultimately I came together to find this novel that crosses a few cultures and national boundaries. So that's a little bit about some of the context, the historical context. And I want to share a bit more about some of the history here. And please interrupt me if I'm going over time here. I don't want to, take away from, I know, great questions that folks will have. So here's a picture of Janusz Korczak with his children. So who was Janusz Korczak? He was born as Hendrik Goldschmidt in 1878 or 1879. There's some confusion about his exact birth year, thanks to his dad. He did not file his birth certificate on time. He was born to a secular Jewish family in Warsaw, and he changed his name to Janusz Korczak later in life. He was many things. It's fair to describe him as a Renaissance man. So he was a military doctor who served in World War I and had extensive training in medicine. He was a children's educator, so he was a contemporary of Maria Montessori. And the two of them and others started to really cultivate this notion of child-centered learning. So, I mentioned my 7-year-old son. Well, he started his second grade putting together I think it's called like a working agreement, which is basically where you come together and kids decide how the class should be run. It's a ridiculous idea, don't repeat this to your professors. But that kind of idea of like providing autonomy to children, is something that runs through Maria Montessori's work and also the work of Janusz Korczak. And so within his orphanage, he had structures like, for example, a children's council, where kids would be able to create their own laws and rules. And he also had this philosophy that you should prepare a child for the difficult things. This was really central. So, for example, if you needed to give a vaccination shot, and that's something that can be unpleasant, then you would first talk about that. You would make sure they had a chance to process it. So you also had kids journaling their feelings from an early age before introducing something that was potentially negative. So preparation was a very important part of this philosophy and pedagogy. And his right-hand person in the orphanage was, she's known in the book as Madame Stefa. So the two of them together ran this incredible orphanage. Janusz Korczak also was a notable figure in Poland at the time. So one of the reasons why he changed his name to Korczak as opposed to Goldschmidt is so that he could, he believed, appeal to a broader audience with a Gentile name, and he had a radio show that was quite popular in Warsaw at the time as well. So he was a celebrity, and he was given multiple opportunities to leave the ghetto and chose not to. He chose to remain with his children. He and Stefania, who's pictured here, chose to stay and provide that really great act of decency. And that is a sense of love that I think runs through this novel and informs Yarek, the main character, informs many of the decisions that he makes. So a few more historical figures, and then I can, if you have time, I'll read a little bit more. If not, I'll switch over to Q&A. So here we have a picture of Spielman. So Janusz Korczak was friends with everybody. He was a very popular figure, and perhaps you may know the movie with Adrian Brody, where he starred as the pianist. So that's based on Spielman's memoir. And during the performance of the Post Office in Warsaw, Spielman introduced it with a performance of Chopin. And Chopin happens to be the main character, Yarek's favorite composer. And that is why. And here you have a quote, it transcends the test. Being a mirror of the self, it transcends emotion, being experience, it transcends acting, being the work of children. So this was written by the prominent Warsaw poet Władysław Szlengo, and it was the text that went on the flyer that was distributed to much of Jewish Warsaw to invite them to the performance. And you could actually find an original copy of this if you go to the Emanuel Ringelblum archive. And we owe Ringelblum such a great debt for preserving, material like this. And so now moving across the world. So this is a book that, as I mentioned, travels continents and cultures. So this play was written by Rabindranath Tagore. And who is Tagore sitting next to on the left-hand side? Who is that? It's Einstein. Yes. Yes, thank you. So Tagore had multiple conversations with Einstein during his lifetime. They're all documented. They're rather highfalutin conversations between the humanist and the scientist. I think they're extremely interesting if you want to look those up. And can anybody recognize the figure who he's sitting with on the right? Gandhi. Yes, that's Gandhi. So Tagore was, of course, very politically involved. He wrote the national anthem for not one, but two countries. And he and Gandhi were friends, but they had differing political views about how the country should be governed, which I won't talk too much more about here. And then, a couple of images here. So from the synagogue in Kolkata, this is the city of my birth on the left. And on the right, this is the old synagogue in Cochin. and the tiles on the floor were donated by Kublai Khan to the Jewish state. And there are artifacts in that temple that were carried over from the second temple of all places. So a very old Jewish community in Cochin that temple is visiting. It's quite marvelous. So I like to share some of these images because it reminds me of home, and also as it starts to get a little colder in New York, it helps me settle in. So and if I have time, I will read just a few more pages here. But before I do, maybe I'll talk a little bit more about the novel and just say that it can be known as perhaps a love story in 3 dimensions. So there is a romantic love story between Yarek, this survivor of Janusz Korczak's orphanage, and a woman from the American South by the name of Lucy. There is also this familial or brotherly love story between Yarek and Misha. Misha also in this novel is someone who was at Janusz Korczak's orphanage. And finally, there's this inherited love story, which is from the love that Dr. Janusz Korczak and Madame Stefa had toward their children, and how that inheritance of love then informs the character's sense of duty. So these are kind of the 3 dimensions, and I'm just going to read a couple of pages here from a chapter that's called 60 Miles East. And it is structured actually in the formal structure of a Japanese poem called Zubitsu. So the Zubitsu is an associative poetic form. I won't geek out too much about it, but it's one way in which I think you can explore traumatic memory that is not fixed, memory that does not have a single version, memory that sometimes turns into itself. So I'm going to read from that, and then I'm going to stop talking. Sometime between living and dying, the train again stopped. It was the moment Yarek remembered more than any other. 30 years, he hadn't grown himself another version. Some memories were like that, bolted and nailed to the mind's eye. You could try to change them, shape them into something they weren't, but you would always be the boy with trousers that reached his ankles, the boy with the tweed cap found by Misha and given special, and the train was stopped now. Who knows whether for a moment or for a longer time, and the guards were shouting because he thought someone ahead had jumped. He was holding Chaim's hand, who he knew didn't have the heart to move an inch, and the heat had already burned, and he had already cried, and Conductor could do nothing because he was just breathing. He thought, jump. The rifles had colored the air outside with smoke. Still, he could see it. The window was big enough, not only for a cat, but also for him. If only he jumped and squeezed through, except the train had started to move again. The screams had died down. The soldiers had stopped firing. He looked at Conductor, and Conductor winked the way he did whenever a mischief had been made, but no one was going to be told, because love was that kind of secret. The train had started moving again, but he saw the sun through the window that was big enough just for him. And what spirit launched his body, what ghost slid him forward, because it was not his 9-year-old bones that did. Still, it happened. He jumped on Chaim's shoulders. He pulled himself up. He went head first, and someone he'd never know pushed his body through the gap. He landed so softly on the sloping hill and rolled so quietly down the field filled with sharp rocks, holding his pain that no soldier heard. For a while, he watched the train pass, expecting others to have followed, but no one else did. Not another soul had jumped on another boy's shoulders and been pushed into the fields. Was he simply the skinniest, the fastest, or just the most daring of them in that car, the one most willing to leave others? Now he was alone again in the field of damp moss. He heard water nearby, and he thought of Conductor's face. So much hope, his knees bloody with it, his left wrist bruised dark. So much hope in the wet grass under his palms, that when the train gnarled away, the old trees called and crawled his way from the light of the sun into the light of the trees. Sometime between living and dying, the train stopped. It was the moment he remembered more than any other. 30 years he hadn't grown himself another version. He heard the first gunshot, saw the two officers turn away, rushed upon Doctor's side, who was breathing so heavily his whole chest heaved with the effort. Yarek pointed to the window, whispered, "We can squeeze through that." Doctor said, "Not all of us can." He looked again, not the darkness, but the light of the waiting. He couldn't tell if Doctor would be afraid. Still, it happened with one held breath. He jumped on Chaim's shoulders and squeezed through. He landed so softly on the sloping hill and rolled so quietly down the field filled with sharp rocks, holding his pain that no one heard. Sometime between living and dying, it was the moment. 30 years, he hadn't grown himself another. Some memories were like that, as stiff as Madame Steppa. He refused to sit the whole time she stood. She guarded the window. On the back of the first gunshot, he bolted, but her legs were like a guillotine. How could he pass through? If we all don't go, you don't go, she said, as if he should have known. He remained by her knees to love your brother, that he had not stolen, he had not thieved. Sometime between living and dying, it was the moment 30 years he hadn't, when Doctor removed his spectacles and rolled. Not all of us can, but you can. Doctor was the one who lifted him up, and Yarek squeezed through the back of the first gunshot, crawled his way from the light of the sun into the light of the trees, his knees bloody with the memory of his old teacher with no spectacles winking at that too bright light. For he had been chosen, he had been.
Thank you. I have to say that bit of text was probably, I remember memories, right? I remember very distinctly reading that passage and feeling as moved as I feel right now. And it actually leads really well to the first question I'd kind of like to ask you. One of the things I noticed about the book is the pattern of repetition, right? There's a sort of circularity, of concentric circles within circles. And to me, that was extraordinarily powerful, as this, it brings to mind, you mentioned kind of the idea of association and memory, or the notion of kind of a screen memory, where a core memory is built upon and built upon and built upon, but then those memories that are so painful can't be changed. Right? And so repetition becomes a pain, it becomes suffering. Repetition, the memory that can't escape. What's really fascinating about this book as a historian is the link between two very separate, very disparate historical moments that are brought together in this text. And so far you've spoken a great deal about the Warsaw Ghetto, but I think it's important to bring in the other significant, historical location of this, which is in the midst of the, emergence of Bangladesh, the Bengali genocide of 1971. And I'd really love it if you could speak a little bit, first of all, about that event, which I think our audience may be a little less familiar with, and to also kind of bring it into the conversation that you create between these two events. I know it's a big ask, but if you could say a few words about that.
Yeah, Yeah, what a beautiful question. Firstly, what I'm going to start with is, I think repetition and structure are deeply important to me as a fiction writer. And one of my favorite forms of structure is sometimes often referred to as chiastic structure or ring composition. This is actually quite prevalent in the Torah, not to mention books like Gilgamesh. So what is ring composition or chiastic structure? Well, it's basically a way in which you can have pieces of a book refer back to each other in a sort of symmetrical shape. So sometimes this is described as ABC here and ABC here, where you have two different time periods, but the pieces are still talking to each other. This is quite common in biblical texts and epics, even common in Harry Potter. So that's one of my favorite structures, and it's something that I come back to as I think about novel structure a lot. So repetition is very important as a fiction writer. I also think that, and I want to get to, but I want to take a slight digression, and I'm talking about a story that begins the Indian epic, the Ramayana. And it's I think it's a pretty interesting story because it's the story of how we are finding the author of that book. So this is the beginning of a book where we're being told a story about how the author of that book is identified and selected. And the way it goes is that there are, the gods get together and decide there's only one person who could write this big book, this epic. And that person has not actually been born yet. So they have to do some time travel first. They do the time travel, they find this person, but there's a problem. This person ends up being a thief and a kind of a lowlife. But somehow they think this is the person who can write this story. And when they go to him and say, well, you have to write this story, you have to write this epic about, that captures the scope of Indian history. The main thing that he can say is the word for death. And he repeats that over and over. The word for death in Sanskrit is mara. Repeats that over and over again. But after a lot of repetition, the word for death changes to another word. And that word is Ram, who is the hero of this epic. And so I think there's also something about repetition that allows for a kind of transformation. And this is also something we see in religious texts of every culture, right? Now I want to go to Bangladesh in 1971. So traveling from the epics to Bangladesh. So there's a lot happening in India at this time. You have Bangladesh that becomes its own nation. It separates from what is then Pakistan to become a Muslim majority nation state where the predominant culture is a Bengali culture. And at that time, many of the Hindu Bengalis cross over the border into Calcutta or surrounding parts of Bengal. My maternal grandparents were refugees. They were landowners in Bangladesh, left with pretty much the clothes on their back when this happened and started the war. In addition to that, there's a lot more going on, but I'll just mention one thing in India, which is there's a so-called Naxalite revolution. So this starts in a small village in Bengal by the name of Naxalbari in 1967. It is a farmer-led revolution, poor people-led revolution, where those folks are revolting so they can get access to the land that they are toiling on, so they can get access to the fruits of their labor. And what begins in this small village then starts to spread to the cities. And it threatens to bring down the whole entire government. I also want to talk a little bit about, if I might, the power of art in this moment in England, and in this moment of political strife that is fraught with all of these elements, the Naxalite revolution, Bangladeshis crossing the border. And we're talking about a particular playwright by the name of Safdar Hashmi. So Hashmi wrote plays that were performed in the streets of Delhi, and one of his plays, there were 200,000 people in attendance. They were mostly union workers, and he was protesting the conditions of those union workers. So this was an opportunity to put on plays that were in service directly of social change. In 1989, Hashmi would be murdered by thugs hired by the Indian government while putting on another play. The next day, his wife would go on to finish the performance of that play. But before his death, Hashmi was asked this question of, do you think your art matters? Do you think it makes a difference that you're putting on this play in the streets? And I want to maybe draw a resonance here with the play that Jan Škorčák is putting on, and this question that Safdar Hashmi is answering decades later. And I think his answer was instructive. He said very directly that, no, I don't think that my plays results immediately in any social change. But I think what they do is they expand our vocabulary of what is possible. They give us a new context by which we might think about this new society that is not yet born, that we might move into. And his wife, who would go on to continue his work, had this phrase that she would talk about, which is that good art outlives its time. And when I think about this Tagore play being performed in those different contexts, I think about Mullah Sri Hashmi talking about how art can outlive its time. I think about Avram Sutzkever, who wrote poems in the ghetto, and how those poems are still read today. So I think when we have art that connects to us, here, it finds a way to sustain itself through cultures.
I'm glad you ended on that note, because this actually touches on precisely another question that I wanted to kind of bring up on precisely that issue of that theme of art. I don't know, redemption isn't the right word, but art and some sort of, I don't know what to call it. It's not resistance, it's not redemption, it's a kind of a gesture. I mean, I'm in sort of sense of what I kind of understand that concept and kind of the kind of concept of a gesture. Actually, Lukács. And so I want to ask, the art that's created is not entirely untainted, right? That's what's interesting, right? So Korczak is presented in a way that there's a certain ennobled quality to his project, but not exactly so the professor, right? Not exactly so. And so I'm curious to tease out a little bit on kind of what perhaps you were saying about this notion of gesture and perhaps its misuse, or I don't know, that's maybe going too far, but that complexity that kind of comes up in the production of the play.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question, because as a writer, I am drawn toward nuance. I think the phrase gesture is absolutely the right phrase. It really resonates with me. And I worry about how any piece of art might be seen without a deeper examination. And that examination, I think, ought to include who is putting this play on, why are they doing it, what are their motives, what is the cultural context in which we're seeing this performance? Who is in the audience? Why are they there as opposed to another group of people? And you're right that I absolutely think that the performance in Warsaw was a noble act, but I also did not want to leave the book without also exploring, I think, some of the darker ways in which art has been invoked to shape cultural moments.
So I would like to ask just one more question, and then I'll invite my colleague to also ask a couple of questions. And this is a personal interest of mine. I would love for you to, and again, I hope this is a good question, but I would love for you to place this. As I was reading the book, I was just struck by parallels in other literature adjacent, well, Holocaust literature, really, or post-Holocaust literature. And I would be curious to hear how you see your book sort of fitting into that framework. What really struck me, the relationship between Lucy and Yadek struck me as very reminiscent of tonally of kind of Styron's work and Sophie's Choice. The representation of New York in that kind of the survivor world in New York, very heavily reminiscent to me of Isaac Bashevis Singer. And then just kind of the sensibility, historical sensibility. I'm astounded when someone can write historical fiction well. Right? It's a very hard genre, I think, to actually have it come together in a voice that sounds authentic. And you managed to do it. And the closest comparison I could come up with was Michael Chabon. And I'm just wondering, I hope those comparisons are flattering and not insulting. I like them. But I'd be curious, how did you have a sense or a feeling about how you imagine this work fitting in? Because it does. I mean, it's part of this world now, whether you like it or not. So I'm curious, what your thoughts are on that.
That's such a big question, and I feel humbled to have my work invoked in the same sentence as Chabon and Singer and Styron. And one very random note about Isaac Bashevis Singer, he lived on the same street as Janusz Korczak's orphanage, Kopalna Lake. So he was also someone who was in those circles. But to get to, I think, the heart of your question, I suppose that the primary question that I come to any book with is, what is the perspective that I can bring to, whether it's a story, a novel, whatever, what is the perspective that I as a writer can bring to this work? So I think that it would not have been appropriate for me to write a book that's set exclusively in Poland, for example. But I think that writing a book of historical fiction that spans between Bengal, New York, where I spent most of my life, and this other world, perhaps that is something where I can wrestle with the subject and also bring a reasonable perspective. So I wanted to kind of talk about this question of permission, because I think it's an important one first. But when it comes to historical fiction specifically, there is of course, the facts, which are very important. But then there is the emotional provenance that I think is perhaps even more important. And in Janusz Korczak's diary, there is this section where he's looking outside of his window and he's observing a German soldier, a young German soldier, and he's imagining who this soldier might be. He's imagining his personality, where he might have come from, and what he might be like outside of those routines. And I think this is a radical act of empathy for Janusz Korczak in his diary to aim for that kind of imagination weeks before deportations. But I think that is what writers are trying to do, which is to say that I think writing is a kind of empathy machine. And so we have the historical facts, but what we're really trying to do is get to this emotional layer, this layer of truth about what characters feel and why they feel the way they feel, because maybe that can tell us something about how we might live our own lives, right? Like writing is a sort of technology. We have, presumably one life to live. Perhaps some of us would disagree, but and how should we live that life? And so I think like in stories, we can get different versions of how that might be possible. So but that's, I guess, how I think about historical fiction, which is a very character-oriented looking at it.
Thank you so much. I'll just ask one question, and I think then we can open it up to everybody else. And looks like do we have some questions coming through on Zoom as well? A few on Zoom, okay. Okay. All right. I teach writing fiction here at Yeshiva, and there are other writers present. It would be great to hear a bit about your creative process and maybe advice that you would have for the writers here today, maybe trying to write their own books one day, but also how they may be able to incorporate research for themselves into their own fiction. Any advice you may have for them?
I guess my first advice is don't do what I did, which is I spent 10 years writing this book. I had no idea how to go about writing a novel, and I think my advice to you is to spend less time and to get it right. But maybe more seriously, one of the primary forms of creative process that I have is borrowed from method acting and also from the work of Natalie Goldberg. So some of you may be familiar with her rewriting exercises, books like Writing Down the Bones, which is this idea that you start the morning and you write whatever comes to you. That's Natalie Goldberg's and just one of her core ideas. And in method acting, you do something where you write journals in characters' voices. So if you're performing a play and you're performing as Hamlet, you would write in Hamlet's voice. This is one of my primary techniques that I have used over the years, whether it's short stories or this novel or the next one. I find that writing in character voices enriches the world that I can create. And Michael Cunningham, who is one of our teachers at Brooklyn College, he used to tell us that every minor character you have in a story is a major character in their own book. So be careful about the minor characters. Treat them with respect and care. And in this book, I have a minor character by the name of Mrs. Paul, who I wrote probably 100 pages in her voice. It was a big part of the novel. I slashed almost all of it, but I'd like to believe that what remains is all the more enriched for that exploration, for that process. So I guess the last thing I'll say is none of it is wasted, right? So if you spend time writing in characters' voices, it is something that will help you as you write a story. And of course, the most important thing is to read broadly to find all those voices. Thank you.
Any questions for Jai?
I hope how that love where it comes from, maybe how it looked, maybe
Sure. Well, I mean, I suppose I could say I am a loveless person, and no. I'll talk about the true story. So yes, I guess yeah. I mean, it's funny. I haven't actually talked about this. This is a new question for me. I'm orienting myself to talk about this. So I met my wife Ilana in a poetry venue, and I guess that's sort of similar to how Yarek and Lucy meet in this novel, which is that they're brought together by art. They're brought together because they're listening to music in the library, as it were. And so what I have found about New York is that people who are very different get a chance to meet and potentially to fall in love. So I guess that's very personally resonant for me. And I talked earlier about my paternal grandparents and how they crossed over a border and started a new family and found ways to enrich their community and the country. So that's also something that's quite. And I guess the last part of it is just getting to have a relationship with my wife's grandmother, Zosha, and hearing about her story. And that also finds its way into these pages. Thank you for that question.
There's a question over here.
We were talking about this wall, and I noticed in the book there was like there was kind of a book being all that starting, but circumstantial. How did that story all that being taken into history for granted?
Yeah, and I'll try to repeat the question for those on Zoom. So the question was, how did the story with Mrs. Paul and the Pauls finding Yarek and sort of bringing them into their family, how did that come to be? Is that a fair statement? So going back to these character journals, one of the questions that I asked my characters is, what is your secret superpower? And for Yarek, I think one of his secret superpowers is that he attracts protectors. He attracts people who fall in love with him. There is something that is very lovable about him. And so when he's in these situations, he finds people who are willing to take care of him in some way, shape, or form. And so I think the Pauls recognize in him a quality that is worth a deeper engagement. And so they follow that through.
Other questions? Ronnie, you want to read some off Zoom? Sure.
What kind of research do you have to do about trauma, the attitude of survivors sharing stories in the 70s or to create arts?
Yeah, sure. So the question was about the research that I had to do about trauma and survivors specifically in the 70s. So I read a lot of firsthand accounts. I was also, of course, deeply influenced by, I mentioned Zosha, her story. And I don't think it was that uncommon, which is to say that she didn't talk about her experience until Steven Spielberg and his team went around and interviewed her for Schindler's List. This was something that happened with a lot of survivors. But until that time, and this was at a point when her kids were grown, she really hadn't talked about her time. And she was, she's from Łódź and liberated from Auschwitz. And I think spending time with her was probably the most significant part of my research, but of course I did also read books about other survivors and first-hand accounts and some more academic texts as well on the nature and psychology of trans.
Another question comes from colleague Seamus O'Malley. In your novel, the protagonist and his fellow orphans have to imagine India as they perform their work. But what was it like imagining how someone imagined like a lot of layers there.
Yeah, okay, so I'm going to try to repeat that question. What was it like to imagine Korchak and the orphans, imagining India, the country of nothing? So in Korchak's diary, and also from some primary sources, there's mention of the play and how the kids are excited to put on costumes, for example. There's mention of some kids putting on turbans and, talking about elephants and that sort of thing. And I guess the way that I thought about it is, for these kids, India was the farthest away possible place. And I'm glad that they had this far away place to imagine. It didn't matter to me that maybe all the details weren't right. I think it was more important that the art was there to provide them the solace that they needed.
So, question right over there to your left.
Oh, okay.
Can you speak a little bit to the idea of art or sort of creation of lending purpose to life? If you think art makes life meaningful, or if art is created because life is inherently meaningful, or you see a difference?
Oh my gosh, these are the best questions. I feel like I'm the wrong person to answer this question. Yeah. So I think the question was, do you think that art is inherently meaningful and allows us to have a sense of purpose, or is our search for purpose something that brings art meaning? Am I getting that right? Sort of. Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, something Vishwanathan, my parents are retired philosophy professors, so you may have invoked in me, but I'll try to keep my answer really brief. And I do think it's absolutely a big part of our search for meaning. That art gives us a way to think about the world and the context in which we live. And I think that it's also something that distinguishes us from other creatures, this desire to make art. I mean, there's certainly plenty of evidence that, visual art making and poetry goes back quite a long way. And so I think it's a very good question you're asking, which is why do we do that and what purpose does it serve? What I can tell you is simply on a personal level is that as I was, when I was living in Jerusalem, I was dealing with a lot of existential questions about what does it mean to live like? Does it actually make sense for me to devote my life to making work? It's like, shouldn't I be doing something that is, like Hashmi was doing? Shouldn't I be going out putting on street plays that are improving the conditions of people? Like, why am I sitting here in my dark room writing? And I think part of the gift that I got from the research of this novel is encountering so many of the folks who were producing art in the Holocaust and how much meaning they found from it, despite the circumstances. There's this story by Charles Simic, the poet, in his book of essays, The Unemployed Fortune Teller, where he talks about this, this tribal custom. He's imagining it, but he's imagining that there is this custom where a person from a village, when they're ready to die, they're sent off into a pit. And all they have is they have their flute. And he writes about Charles Simic, the Nobel Prize winning poet, writes about in his essay what it's like for this person from the village who's living in the pit to perform music during the final days. And what he says is that in the beginning, the art that is produced is florid. It is full of a kind of over description of music. But then over time gets reduced to its most essential quality. And that most essential quality, that is the core of the thing that I think we as writers and maybe as visual artists are going for. And I think that is the thing that Simic was talking about in this essay as well. So I hope that speaks to your question. It's a really profound one. Thank you.
So I imagine you mentioned about writing journal characters that for historical fiction, and in general, maybe writing fiction to get inside of each character to express their own view of the world, each character's separate view of the world. Obviously, you yourself have a whole life experience that comfortable with the world. You yourself with these experiences. If you find in one way you find that maybe your perspective based on the way that you form these characters' perspective or maybe their creation in some sense of your perspective or thinking just by you almost embody the character and forget yourself.
Yeah, so that's another terrific question. Thank you so much. And I just tried to repeat it, which is that in what ways does my perspective as Jai Chakrabarti inform the characters in the novel? You know, are my political ideas, for example, getting through and informing these characters? So, you know, my greatest influences were the modernists. I think that there is no greater writer in the English language than Virginia Woolf, for example. And I am much more interested in following characters for who they are. And I recognize there is going to be this conceit. I recognize that it's going to be an imperfect pursuit, that I am going to be, you know, leaking some of my own thoughts, but that is at least the way in which I'm starting. And some of these sections are written in play form. Where I got that idea was from, again, another modernist, from Joyce. And in Ulysses, you have this sort of exploration of a character's consciousness of a single person. And he's trying all kinds of different things. He's trying different points of view, different kinds of writing structure. And finally, in chapter 13, the Circe chapter, he tries the play form. And in the play form, you get a combination of the authorial voice through the stage direction, but you also get the characters. So I think like that's one way in which I encountered that is like, I think like, you know, some of the stage direction you get to see be very direct. Thank you so much.
To your left,
Yes.
there are a lot of jumps in time before you left, after you left. What made you decide to start a story where
opposed to just on their own.
Yeah, so the question was, what made me decide to start the story where I did, because there's a bunch of time jumps in the book. So I believe in starting stories, in the middle. And I think there's something that I'm drawn to in stories where it's a stranger in a strange land kind of thing. And we as readers are trying to figure out what's going on. I think that's pretty common in sort of the tradition of quest narratives, right? So I guess that's something that I'm drawn to as a reader. And so that's kind of what I went with as a writer.
I think we're just about out of time. I just want to mention, Jai, you have a story collection coming out in February, right? Okay, so that's something to look forward to. And if you haven't gotten your copy yet, play for the end of the world, please pick it up. Would you be willing to hang out for a few minutes and sign a copy or two?
Absolutely. I brought like 5 copies.
Okay. All right, great. Please join me in thanking Jai Chakrabarti.
That was wonderful, really wonderful exchange. I want to thank our partners in this, the YU English Department, the Schottenstein Honors Program, Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies, the Fish Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. I really want to thank all of you. I know how busy all of you are. I know how busy the students are right now. This is midterms. And I know you were bribed and you were probably cajoled in all sorts of ways to get here. So your presence, watching you absorb and think and process and those questions, it's really, it's why it's so wonderful to teach here. I want to thank my colleagues who made time to come out. It's not easy, I know. I want to thank the wider community, people who are here who came from all different parts, across the bridge, downtown, over the other bridge, wherever you might have come from. So please come back. We hope to always have a forum for great ideas and exchange. So thank you all. Thank you all for coming.